So, hi, good morning. My name is Julia. This is my first time speaking at EmberConf. You can find me on Twitter as username Julia D, or just about everywhere else as Donaldson Julia, or some variation on that theme. I'm a developer with Crunchy Bananas, and I'm really lucky to get to work with Ember every day and build cool things. So let's jump right in. So Ember's awesome, right? That's kind of why we're all here. It's super productive. It's designed with developer experience in mind. Add-ons to solve common problems can be added to your app with a single command. It's ultra efficient. There's no wrangling with custom build system or test suite setup. I mean, we all know this. You write less code and get more done faster. And then someone mentions the learning curve, and it's a bummer. It's frustrating when someone criticizes something that we see so much value in. Ember has such an incredible community of people surrounding it that it can be easy to dismiss critics with an attitude of, they just don't get it. Because we get it. I know that I'm not alone in feeling that there is something really special about Ember. But the question remains, why is it special? It can be hard to explain exactly why we feel so strongly about Ember, right? So we rephrase and reiterate the brand messaging about productivity and developer superpowers. We retweet and repost and double down on our arguments. And that's not to say that those arguments aren't incredibly strong. Developer superpowers is a really good reason to use Ember. But again, we come back to the learning curve. And at this point, it feels kind of like a high school nickname or a rumor that never really went away. But really, it keeps coming up because we haven't answered the question. Not really. So, everything has a learning curve. React has a learning curve. JavaScript has a learning curve. And yeah, Ember has a learning curve too. The learning curve becomes an obvious target when the bulk of our advocacy is based on productivity and developer experience. And it's a valid point. Many would argue that it's hard to be productive faster when learning takes time. Most investors and project managers just don't care about a fuzzy, abstract future time in which their teams are more productive. So how do we respond to critics who would argue that Ember's learning curve negates the very productivity it promises? Now, I know that I'm speaking at EmberConf, so I don't anticipate a particularly tough sell when it comes to Ember. But how we as a community advocate for Ember matters. I want to answer the question of why Ember from a different perspective. And here it is. Ember isn't really about productivity. So before I continue, let me back up and explain a little bit more about myself and why I feel so passionately about Ember. When I first discovered Ember, I was not an ambitious developer. I was insecure and shy and struggling to find a place for myself in a new industry. Before I was a professional developer, I was a fashion designer. I went to Parsons School of Design, I interned at Vogue magazine, and I worked as a designer for 8 years. And I know that seems like a crazy career jump to make, but working as a fashion designer isn't as different from software development as you might think. Ultimately, it's about building solutions within a certain set of requirements. A typical user story might be, as a user, I should be able to move my arms in a jacket, or as a user, I should be able to walk in a pair of shoes. And I know those requirements might seem really obvious, but take a look at this runway photo and see if you can spot the hot fix for a bug that we discovered only minutes before the show. So yes, that is duct tape, and yes, we used duct tape to tape the models into their shoes because they kept flying off of their feet as they walked. Luckily, the look of duct tape actually worked with the spacesuit theme of the collection. But it goes to show that just like the applications we develop, the user experience we expect from the clothes and shoes we wear is not a coincidence, nor is it a given. What you see on the runway or in stores, just like on the web, is the result of a whole process of engineering and problem solving. The process of creating a new design echoes many of the iterative methods of software development we're familiar with. Start with a sketch of the idea, drape and make a pattern for the garment, create a tech pack for the factory with details on construction and sewing, receive a first sample, debug fit issues and make changes, see a revised sample, and that repeats until the garment is ready for production or the runway. Wanting to become a developer was, for me, a natural extension of the things that drew me to fashion design in the first place. I was always obsessed with iterations of product, constantly chasing a better and more elegant solution to things like the construction of a blouse. I love the challenge of building creative solutions within a set of requirements. I find structure and restrictions to be really inspiring. So I decided to follow my instinct and just dive in. In 2016, I quit my job as a designer and graduated from Code Bootcamp. What was that transition like is a question I get asked a lot. And it went a bit like this. Honestly, it was incredibly difficult. There were a lot of tears, I will admit. It felt like I was suddenly in a country in which I didn't speak the language. Sure, I could order dinner and ask for directions, but that's very different from truly communicating and being understood. I realized just how often we make judgments about others' skills or intelligence based on their ability to communicate using the right words, whether or not they fit our mental model of how a good developer talks. How often have you sized up whether or not a candidate or team member can handle a given task based on nothing more than how they speak about the code? Now, I'm not arguing that someone's ability to communicate effectively is not important. Communication is a skill like any other, but it is a skill that can be learned. And often we mistake the communication for the idea. And that's what drew me to development in the first place. New ideas are exciting to me. I want to spend my time working with ideas, listening to ideas, learning from them, and creating new ones. The tools we choose are simply vessels for our ideas. The right tools make it easier for us to bring our ideas out of the abstract and transform them into something tangible. David Bale's book, Art and Fear, is an exploration on the discipline of the creative process. In it, he writes, "Vision is always ahead of execution. Knowledge of materials is your contact with reality." This book was required reading for all students when I was at Parsons, but I return to his writing often as a developer because I find the process of coding to be very similar to the process of designing or making art. At the core of both practices is the challenge of navigating the vast space between the idea and the finished work. And that's a big space, right? Even the best ideas don't always make it to the other side in one piece. We can all relate to that feeling of frustration that comes from struggling to bring the vision you had in your head into the real world as something tangible. It can kind of feel like something has been lost in translation between your imagination and reality. And the challenge only grows when you increase the complexity of what you're trying to create. Because in order to bring our ideas into the world, we need to be able to communicate them. Whether it's paint, words, musical notes, emojis, or code, the tools we choose become like players in a game of telephone between our brain and the rest of the world. One of the great difficulties I faced after switching careers was the question of how to communicate my thoughts in a way that was productive and meaningful, and most importantly, in a way that would demonstrate my potential as a capable developer. Because communication is really hard. Talking about code is hard. And with a background in fashion design, I quickly realized as I was looking for jobs that knowing how to code was only half the battle. With every interview, I felt like there was an unspoken message at some point of, oh, we didn't realize this was your second language. We're really looking for a candidate who's a native speaker. And after many months with no results, I was seriously considering returning to fashion and just telling myself that I didn't want to sit at the table with cool professional developers anyways. I could just code in my free time and return to an industry that seemed to understand my value. Now, of course, I didn't expect to get a senior level position like the one I had come from in fashion. I was fully aware that starting a new career meant starting from the ground up. But I also knew that I was smart and capable. At the last position I held, I was responsible for the design and production of tens of thousands of imported products. And yet I found myself struggling to communicate my ability as a problem solver when it came to talking about code and development. It was around that time that I decided to try Ember. And what I found in Ember is something that really changed everything for me. It gave me a vocabulary with which to frame my ideas. It provided a structure within which I could be creative and showcase my ability. I was able to communicate better with other developers and learn from them, and my growth as a developer increased exponentially as a result. Because at the core of the Ember ethos is convention, and convention provides us a common language that allows us to better communicate what our ideas are. The conventions and patterns of Ember democratize the language we use to describe our applications. Developers of all different levels and all different backgrounds are given the tools to communicate in a meaningful and productive way. And this creates a cyclical dynamic. As a developer, effectively communicating and being understood by others leads to better solutions and better code, which then builds confidence and validates one's value as a developer, which motivates and encourages participation and hence productivity across teams, resulting in more communication and more voices, which means more ideas, which results in even better solutions and better code. No one has to stay on the bench, so to speak. Ember's conventions effectively funnel contributions from every team member. Junior developers want to become senior developers, and all developers want to be productive and contribute. If you create an environment that naturally supports that cycle of growth through communication and feedback, everyone wins, and you end up with a better product overall. Because web development isn't really about the individual anymore. The web itself has scaled up. Any successful application will inevitably need more hands on deck to continue growth. So the tools we choose should connect us. External shared conventions remove boilerplate discussion and lengthy onboarding. Consider the learning curve when you jump onto a new project and you're first looking at a directory full of React code that you yourself did not organize or create. And sure, every app has its quirks, but Ember's conventions mean that conversations between developers start with a shared understanding of the core context. Discussions can more quickly focus on the big ideas that make your app distinct rather than the nuanced details of your custom file structure or your data layer internals. New team members can start being productive immediately. And senior team members have more time to tackle big challenges because boilerplate explanations are essentially outsourced to places like the Ember guides and discussion boards. The value of pair programming sessions is maximized because time doesn't need to be spent explaining the core structural elements. Both developers start on the same page. Time that would normally be spent explaining the context surrounding the problem becomes time spent solving the problem. And in this way, barriers to mentorship are removed. Mentorship no longer becomes an exclusive relationship, but a natural dynamic between all team members with cascading effect. With tools like Slack or Discord, powerful feedback from one team member can extend outward exponentially. Anyone reading can quickly understand the core context of the lessons discussed. And the experience at EmberConf is a perfect example of this. Consider how many lines of code you had to examine carefully in order to learn meaningful and practical lessons from yesterday's presentations. Probably not that many. I absolutely left last year's conference as a better developer writing better code. And that was without detailed study of the source code that all of the speakers provide links to. That alone is a really powerful testament to the value of Ember as a tool not just for developers individually, but for development teams, especially large or remote teams. We often prioritize scalability in our applications from a technical point of view, but scalable communication is equally as important and often overlooked. And this is something that the fashion industry taught me really well. Fashion is an industry in which, at the professional level, it's impossible to control every detail of your idea's execution. You must be able to communicate your vision in a way that is understandable to others. Typically, you are handing off your design to a pattern maker who creates the map for the garment, who then is giving it to a factory or multiple factories to sew the separate pieces together into a whole. And often this is happening across continents. Misunderstandings are super common as you move through the various stages of creating an idea, especially with the globalized nature of garment production. You might be working with somebody who is interpreting your design but doesn't speak your same language. I often experienced factories correcting what they perceived to be mistakes, but they were actually meant to be, asymmetrical or like a weird shape. And because of this, convention-based communication is built into the industry at almost every level. There are industry standards for points of measure. There are conventional methods of construction with distinct names. There are even standards for how to grade garments into bigger or smaller sizes. And humans have been making clothing for far longer than they've been making software. So the concept of bike shedding is almost non-existent when it comes to what we now consider the basics of garment construction. No one's arguing about the validity of sleeves. And some of the most influential and iconic moments in fashion are built on top of these conventions. Some of you might know this famous moment from Alexander McQueen's Spring-Summer 1999 show, in which the dress was painted by large robotic arms. It was a moment that was at once completely groundbreaking, but also relied on garment conventions like a belted waist to keep the dress on her body. Designers continue to innovate and push boundaries while still using a shared vocabulary of standards that allow the body to move and function. In fact, there is a tool in fashion called the pattern block that addresses that very issue of basic fit and function for a garment. A pattern block represents the simplest version of a garment that fits a body. When I refer to a pattern, I'm talking about the flat shapes that are cut from fabric and eventually sewn together to create a garment. The concept behind the pattern block is that things like a well-fitting armhole or a neck opening that you can get your head through shouldn't have to be engineered from scratch every time. Your new idea begins with a foundation of solutions, proven to work. So here's a really simple example of this concept. The idea is that you take the basic pattern block and use it as your starting point. Oh, let's go back. Was it playing, the video? Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So you take the basic pattern block, start there, and from there you splice and morph the shapes using pattern making technique to create a different design. So you end up with a new design, but you can be confident that certain core measurements will fit and function well. You don't have to grapple with the same fit issues every time. So creativity and ingenuity become the focus of your work. And that was a really basic example, but as you can see, there are much more complex things you can do using this methodology. Relying on a foundation of building blocks to push ideas forward can yield incredible innovation. Shared fundamental conventions and vocabulary allow for creativity to come together as the result of many hands. And whether it's code or couture, innovation is really the point, right? Innovative creative code is what makes the difference between a product that soars and a product that simply works. Ember's structure begets creativity. It funnels creative energy into features that matter. Because creative energy is an ephemeral thing. We all know what it feels like to be in the zone and how easy it can be to lose that momentum, especially when you have to spend your creative energy on something like a massive config file. We need to choose tools that maximize creative energy spent meaningfully. Ember's conventions allow us to let creativity and exploration drive our work. And Ember not only encourages individual creative potential, but harnesses the combined creative power of teams. It drives collaboration by providing a fundamental structure within which all parties can be creative and contribute. Because successful collaboration requires both communication and trust. When you're building something with others, there's always the risk that another person might derail the project rather than add to it. You might be tempted to avoid developers from different backgrounds because you feel safer letting someone with a CS degree work on your project. It can be easy to think that avoiding collaborative efforts is the safest path. So in this case, creative potential is forfeited for safety. And that's why the conventions that Ember provides are so valuable. It provides a foundation of trust so that when we work together, we can feel secure that a shared understanding exists. It becomes easier for us all to speak the same language. Because collaboration can yield incredible work. Diversity of thought pushes us forward. It forces us to move outside of our comfort zone as creators and developers. Difference of perspective is what drives true innovation. And more perspectives inform better solutions. And that's the magic that Ember gives us as a tool. Too often in web development, we frame our understanding of ambition with words like productivity or speed. It's easy to lose focus of what we are building in the first place. We start working on ambitious code for code's sake and lose sight of the idea. It's easy to think that using the newest, trendiest libraries will make our applications better, that ambition is defined by the code itself. And when you start to think like that, sure, things like the learning curve or trendiness of a given framework can distract you. It distracts you from the whole point of using a framework at all. Frameworks and code don't make new ideas. People make new ideas. The code we write every day is how we express those ideas to the real world. The framework we choose should be helping us to close the gap between abstract imagination and the tangible result. Elvis Presley said, "Ambition is a dream with a V8 engine." And that's really how I think about Ember as it relates to ambition and development. Ember gave me the tools that allowed me to become an ambitious developer. Because Ember powers ambition and innovation by connecting us and our ideas through the conventions and vocabulary it provides us. And it's pretty productive, too. Thank you.